Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott.
I'm Amy Sandler, and today we are excited to chat with someone that our audio engineer, Nick Carissimi, met out in the wild. This is Chloé van Bergen, Vice President of Operations at Secretly Group, which is a leading independently owned music company. Chloé has more than 15 years experience in the creative industry sector, fluent in 5 languages. Chloé is here today to discuss her experiences introducing Radical Candor at what could be described as a complex, legacy-driven company. You can flesh that out further for us, Chloé. So you've had to navigate unionization, address cultural barriers, and Chloé's going to share what we believe is a really grounded look at leadership, communication, and driving change at scale. So welcome, Chloé.
Thank you for having me.
Thrilled that you're here. I would love to hear the story about how you and Nick, I think you were at a wedding, how you came to be talking about Radical Candor at a wedding.
I guess I will jump in. Thank you guys for having me on. I don't normally join. So
you're always here, just not
I'm always here. I'm lurking.
You're the wind beneath our wings, and now the wind is speaking.
I like that. I'm a background guy. Always have been. Earlier this year, my brother and my sister went to London to go for my brother's, as they say there, stag do. Okay. So we went there for his bachelor party. This is going to be an awesome episode. I'm very excited about this episode because it seems to be very un-radical candor and how this all got set up. But we went for my brother's stag do, and we're hitting up different pubs, and there was a big group of us. Chloé has been friends with my brother for what? How long? How long have you known Danny?
Like about 10 years.
Okay. So we had not met before. So I don't know where we're at in the pub crawl, but we finally get to start talking. And she asked what I did. And I mentioned that I work in podcasts and I edit podcasts. Now, I've been editing podcasts for a long time. And you always see the millions of downloads and all of this stuff. But I never, ever seem to meet a person that actually listens to the shows that I work on. So we're in this super loud pub. My brother is dressed up as a beef eater. And I said, I work on a few different podcasts. One of them is called Radical Candor. It's like business communication. And she stopped me and said, "Oh, are you serious?" And I said, yeah. I said, why? And she said, I love that show. I've read the book. I've applied it at my job. That's incredible. I love that show. I love Kim. It's great. And I was blown away. And it is not my job on this show to book guests, but I'd had a few drinks. And so I was like, look, I'm not promising anything, but I think you'd be a great guest for the show. The industry that you work in is not one that we've ever talked about, to my knowledge. I said, you're younger. I think that your position at the job would be great. You're utilizing our formulas and methods. Let me talk to Brandy and let me see what happens. We had a great pre-interview with Brandy and Amy, and now here we are. We also got to hang out at a wedding in Mexico where my brother actually lives. So we're on different continents. We're now digital. We're all over the place. But it was such a fun way to get to know Chloé, and I'm very excited for today's show. It's going to be exciting and fun.
So excited to hear your side of this story, Chloé.
And do you know this man, Chloé? Have you ever laid eyes on this guy, Nick?
I'm sincerely hoping that this is actually how it happened.
I can confirm the story. And it was really funny. It was really funny to me because like this party, like this bachelor party or stag do as it's called in the UK, everyone was in the music industry. His brother and the groom-to-be used to be a tour manager. Everyone at this party is either a musician or a manager or an agent or in music. And, I started talking to Nick, he's a brother, and I'm just like, hey, so what do you do? And so giving a bit of like a, let's have some conversation. I think it was just such a moment of connection. I think he just put this like small voice of, it's like, you probably haven't heard about this and so on. And I just immediately went like, you mean Kim Scott? And he just went like, what? Like, what just happened? Like, we're in a party here. Everyone works in music. We didn't expect to be talking about like, company management, et cetera. It was a really funny moment.
Love it. Love it. And I'm also really excited to hear about sort of at the end of Radical Candor, I talk about how you can roll your own radical candor. We can help train people, but what I really love is hearing about how people have read the book and then how they're applying it in the companies where they work. So I'd love to hear like what worked, but also some radical candor on radical candor. What didn't work so well for you?
Maybe, Chloe, just before we jump into your rolling your own, just a little background on, because I assume we're talking at Secretly Group, is that correct? Yeah. So maybe for folks who aren't as familiar, because as Nick said, we haven't had a lot of music business folks on the podcast, just kind of paint a picture, first of all, of the company, but also maybe the industry and how that relates to your rolling out of Radical Candor.
Of course. So, yeah, Secret Group is an independent label group. It's about 30 years strong at this point. There's quite a few different companies under, we sort of call it like the Secretly universe, and it's about 7 record labels, this publishing company, a distribution company, and there's also some capital interest in a few other music related ventures like a vinyl manufacturing plant and so on. The most prominent artists to rise from its ranks include Grammy winning Bon Iver, Phoebe Bridgers, Mitski, Japanese Breakfast, The War on Drugs, and a long list of incredible talent. Personally, what I find particularly interesting about this company, and I'd like to spend a moment talking about it, is the genesis story of how it came to be, because I think it's really telling also of the culture that the company has today. And it'll be no surprise that the music industry is a highly competitive space. And there's 3 companies that dominate 80% of the market share, those being Universal, Warner, Sony. And that remaining 20% is thousands of independent labels globally. It's a highly, highly competitive space. It can be really brutal in its competition. About 30 years ago, these 2 brothers in Bloomington, Indiana, in college, they start this little label and they have no idea what they're doing. My boss is one of those brothers. I'm sure you'll have no problem me saying this. They were literally trying to find out how to burn a CD and sell it to a store. A couple of years later, they find this other highly intelligent college student who's doing the same thing. He sets up this other label called Jack Jaguar, and they get to talking. And I think they just realize that, hey, this is a really hard thing to do. Joining forces, they could achieve a common goal together instead of competing against each other. So that's how the original Secretly Group forms. They come together, try and find ways of, paths of achieving a common goal. And it's so anathema, I think, to how most of the industry is geared. It's, again, high competition, individualism. And this is a company that instead of driving towards that competition decides to put the egos at the door and try and build together and form this group. And now about 7 labels and so on. So they've kind of continued down that path. And I think it's still culturally a space of close collaboration rather than high competitive drive. And personally, that really resonates. And I think it's a really powerful message.
And why is it called Secretly?
So the original label, the one that the 2 brothers founded, is called Secretly Canadian. And if I'm not mistaken, it was because they grew up close to the border with Canada. They were going through a list of artists and musicians who, as we know, there are many Canadian musicians that are considered to be American, just they're sort of like staples of American music, but they're actually Canadian. And I think they were just conceptually going through a list of names of artists that were American, but they could be Canadian. So I think it just started in that way. That's the lore. That's what I've been told.
Love it. What's your role at the company?
I'm the vice president of operations, ex-North America.
And so how did you hear about Radical Candor, and how did you decide to start rolling it out?
So I owe that to my friend and colleague, our head of people, Kelsey Carbone. And what had happened actually is I was on a bit of a drive or a bit of a mission of exploring vulnerability in both my personal and professional life. It was something I've struggled with in practice and conceptually, and I was, trying to explore that a little bit. I was obviously reading Brené Brown, Atlas of the Heart, Daring Greatly. But there were these other couple of management books that I was reading at the time. One was Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara, and the other one was Scaling People by Claire Hughes Johnson.
I were on the same team at Google together.
That's awesome.
Yes, I love her.
So I think she has this phrase in the book that she says often. It's like, say the thing you think you cannot say. Will was saying this thing about how feedback is investment. And I was discussing these concepts with Kelsey, our head of people. She was hearing me in this and she was like, hey, I think there's this book that you would really enjoy. And she points me towards Radical Candor, and I read it. And I just immediately went to her and I was like, oh my God. And I actually sent her like this list of bullet points of like, these bits like really resonated with me. So it really changed my perspective actually on what feedback is. And I think it just like was one of these other forces that were kind of make me like understand this concept. Like, if I open myself up, I think others will start to do the same. As sort of, again, embracing this concept of vulnerability in the workplace.
Love it.
One of the things that I'm curious about, Chloe, is like, I find fascinating maybe who we were before we read a book or before we were introduced to an idea. And then there's kind of this aha. And then it almost seems like so obvious. And how did I not know this thing? But even, I just want to highlight, like you said, it kind of changed your perspective on what feedback was. And so I think especially for people who are listening to the podcast, whether if they're new to Radical Candor, they're just joining in, or they are familiar with it, it can be very helpful to actually get really clear on that mindset shift, right? Because you're talking about being vulnerable and you're talking also about the shift in feedback. And I'm curious, like, what were the challenges, maybe the pain points that kind of were inspiring you to make some changes? Where were you struggling at that moment?
I think the bit that really opened it up was there's a certain permission, in the book where you're sort of saying like, hey, the urgency was, the second worst thing you can do is like be ruinously empathetic, right? It's like you're being unconstructive. You're not allowing them to grow. And, that was sort of like the first bit that made me like, oh, I think I do that. I think I'm sometimes not challenging directly. And the permission comes when it's like, well, the second best thing you can do is be an asshole. And it points to this bit of, this permission of like, you might be a brute, but you're actually kinder being a brute than avoiding the point altogether. And I think I came from a place where I think my factory setting is probably I'm trying to be more diplomatic. I'm trying to avoid conflict. I'm trying to keep the peace and so on. So when I was maybe delivering feedback, I was probably leaning a bit too far into the like, hey, like I don't, the shit sandwich. I'm going to make you feel good about this thing that I'm going to say. But I'm probably not going to really say the thing that I'm trying to say because I'm trying to make you feel good.
Yeah, and I struggle. It's probably why I wrote the book. My factory setting is the same as yours. And it was really, for me, at least, as I was writing the book and thinking, like it was hard to write, and in fact, Amy and I have had some conversation about, is it really second best? Would much rather, in the end, have someone be obnoxiously aggressive than ruinously empathetic with me, because then at least I know where I stand. It feels more like it's out in the open. To me, ruinous empathy feels very threatening if I'm aware it's happening, and it makes me feel actually less safe than obnoxious aggression. So it's interesting. Not everybody feels you can't do the right thing if you don't know what you're doing wrong. And so,
yeah. And there's a real cultural aspect to that as well. And, I think that's sort of like also part of this is, working across a company that has like teams across different regions. We've got teams in America, we've got teams in the UK and other places in Europe. And I think the common language is actually sometimes it's actually not a common language. It's quite different. And I say this about our UK team a lot. It's like, they love tiptoeing around the elephant, Our head of HR, Kelsey, the HR department is actually based old in America. In a recent conversation, it came up that one of the UK managers had a tough conversation with the employee, and one of the HR members was on the call and sort of took a moment to pause the conversation and just kind of the HR person delivered, it's like checking for understanding. It's like, hey, I just want to make sure that you understand that you're in hot water right now, like this is what the deal is. And then at the end of the conversation, the UK management like, oh my God, that was so American. I could never do that. And it's like, no, you can, and you should, and I do know the politeness is totally true. That you bump into someone on the road and they will apologize instead of you. 100%. I've actually started doing that. It's just like the cultural understanding that you have. So I think it's a lot harder in the UK to get real honest feedback. I think I struggle actually with that, even with my own reports. And I try to create an environment where like even I'm offering, just kind of, again, the checking for understanding thing. I might say like, hey, like pretty much every one-on-one, I'll be like, what can I do to make your work life better? Do I need to get out of the way? Do you need me to step in? I sort of offer options because I'm like, maybe if I say that, they might be like, oh yeah, that's something you could do. Because if I just ask it plainly, it'd be like, oh no, everything's fine, everything's great. Then we have teams in the Netherlands. I love my Dutch team.
Radical open-hearted. It's
called. If what you're saying, Kim, is like you just like knowing where you stand. Yeah. You know where you stand. And I have a Dutch grandma. I love her dearly. And I recall sort of like sitting at the dinner table, and I just bought like a pair of, reading glasses. There's like, thick black rims. And she just, quietly looks up at me. She's like, I don't like those glasses on you. And like, she means no harm. And she also follows that up with, but of course it's you who needs to like them, which like in any other culture would probably be like the most passive aggressive thing you could say. But it's not mean. She's just saying her opinion. And in that, she's also sort of saying, but why would you care about my opinion? In a way, it's just the real permission to just like, you leave the emotions aside. It's not an emotional conversation. You're just saying what you think. And I think that place just leads to a lot more constructive. Yeah. And it's a lot safer. Yeah. When things are good, I trust they're good. I don't think they're just putting up a front.
Yeah. And I mean, the other wonderful thing about what your grandmother did there was she was saying, I'm telling you what I think, but what really matters is what you think. It was humble and confident at the same time. I love that. Mm-hmm. I also had my grandmother was not Dutch, Irish, I guess, a bit Irish American, but her sister, she had 3 sisters, and they called her Ask Alice. And what they meant by that was, if you really want to know if your butt looks big in those jeans, ask Alice, because she'll tell you. And she was definitely radically candid, Granny Alice. She taught me a lot.
I love Granny Alice. We all need a Granny Alice in our lives.
Yes.
Chloé, I'm curious, when you talked, we talk so much on this podcast about emotions, and you talked about your own work around building vulnerability, seeing that as a strength. Obviously, Brené Brown has done so much amazing work with that. And, Kim and I, like she said, will often talk about, we have very different kind of, I think we actually both have the same default setting. It just expresses itself differently in terms of our kind of emotional makeup. So if Kim's going to prefer obnoxious aggression, I would actually probably still prefer ruinous empathy, even though I don't know what's happening. But so I think we do have different ways into it because of almost like the risk reward profile there. But I'm so curious, like, what have you done that kind of built up your own capacity to have these kinds of conversations, like to get more comfortable if there were some emotions, or to get more comfortable, like asking for feedback from your team? What are some of the things, because it seems like you've been on your own personal journey with it.
I think when you're trying to learn a new board game, you have to start playing. That's how you're really going to get to the bottom of it. So I think with it was just finding the moments where I could muster up the courage and do it, say the thing. And I believe that the real blocker for most people when they are really scared about that vulnerability, it's the fear of rejection. You don't want to hurt someone because you don't want to break a relationship, and what happens then, and whether that's a friendship or a relationship or with a colleague at work. And I think there's something actually that Brené says in one of her books, and it's like, it's one thing to be rejected for who you are, but it's another thing entirely to be rejected for someone you're not. And I think the way that translates a bit, it's like, if you're speaking your truth and, that doesn't land well, at least you said your piece. You were honest with yourself. Whereas if you don't say something, ignore a situation, and it gets worse, then you're like double bummed because like, A, the situation is bad, and also you silent yourself. You were not honest with yourself.
Or with other people.
Right. So, that's a bigger jeopardy. So it's like, well, you might as well rather just start saying your piece. And if it doesn't land well, you'll deal with it. What's the worst that could happen? I think you kind of have to enter a bit that stoic line of thought as well, of just, you know, what's the worst that could happen here? And it's like you start going down that spiral, it's probably not that bad. You'll probably still be okay. So I think I started that way, just having small conversations. And honestly, I think I started at work, like in the work environment. And it was through seeing progress in that I was able to translate some of that into my own personal life.
I think that's so interesting and so true. Like in many ways, the stakes for your relationships at work are lower than the stakes in your personal life. And therefore it can be easier to experiment with different ways of being at work. It's easier. It's not always easy, but it's easier to get a new job than a new family, for example. I love that. So you were leading operations. What was the operational situation you came into when you took the job? And did you apply Radical Candor to some of the operations and systems that you saw at the company?
So I joined the company at an interesting time. It was summer 2020, so we're into pandemic.
Yeah.
It was interesting for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, the company was already, 2.0 or like 3.0 iteration even. It already had a few commercial successes. But I think they saw they were on the road to see a new class or a new string of commercial success. They want to reach scale. They bring me on board as one of their key hires internationally, and I'm tasked with building an international team, expanding into different territories, and so on. I joined right over COVID, full pandemic. I don't meet my colleagues face to face for the best part of 2 years. And it's really hard to build meaningful relationships in that time. But what it did award me actually is like, because I maybe wasn't able to spend that much time face to face with people and creating connections, I had the other vantage point that I could really get deep into, platforms, systems, workflows. I could really lift the hood and like get a really good sense of like how the machine was working. I also had the vantage point of having worked at other music companies. So, had a certain sense of like how others do it. And I could compare and, share notes. So I think from the start, I could already tell like, oh, here's some things that I think we need to, bring up to speed. They were, again, the label had been built like 30 years prior, often on platforms that, as we know, they were DIYing it. They were just kind of figuring out how to do the stuff. And we had, legacy software that we're still using, and a lot of stuff had to be modernized. So I think I just spent my first 6 months to a year probably just quietly collecting a list of garden variety innovations or improvements that we're going to have to at some point tackle. That I figured, could make the teams move faster and more efficiently. That was my core mission at the end of the day. But it was hard. I'd say, it was definitely hard. I had a few headwinds for sure. And, we had employees who'd been there for, 10 plus years. So call it the class of 10 years. There's a good number of them, which is awesome, speaks obviously to staff retention, but also something that comes with it is like, if you're used to doing things a certain way for a long time, it's harder to accept change. And also I'm the new guy, right? So like, who are you? Like, why are you telling me I need to do things differently? So I think I really realized that I needed to build that trust over time before I could really start having conversations about how we're going to inflict change. And that was, I'd say it maybe wasn't in the practice of radical candor back then. I was probably trying to be like a little too diplomatic. I think when I was originally having these conversations, I was getting a lot of pushback. There was, management who were either risk averse or averse to change, or other managers that were used to being consulted on, topics or on certain projects that, were no longer like under, their remit. And I was potentially overreaching. And there was like a lot of tension in that sense. And I think even worse than pushback, some stuff I was being met with indifference. And that's just so much worse, right? Like if there's tension, at least we can move forward. We can just, there's an opportunity for change. If there's indifference, it's just such a momentum killer, right? It's like, it's just nothing.
Yeah, with a wall of silence.
Right. On reflection, I probably should have invited more disagreement. I probably should have pushed for
soliciting feedback.
Exactly. And I think I was still in a way of just like maybe trying to be very diplomatic, minimizing the conflict. And in reflection, I think I could have gotten there a lot faster by just, again, like soliciting feedback and just being like, okay, let's have it.
And when was there a point where things changed for you?
Yes, there was a moment where I felt like there was more urgency. And that was when we were on a bit of a hiring spree. We're adding headcount. I think we're adding headcount to teams that I didn't feel were right sized or not quite the right fabric and so on. And I think it was during that time that I felt like, okay, we actually need to make changes now. The jeopardy is just so much higher if we just kick the can down the road.
Yeah. So you started figuring out who was going to get promoted and who wasn't going to get promoted and who maybe needed to be managed out. Is that what?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's really tough.
Yeah.
What was your timing on that with when you were reading Radical Candor, the idea of sort of Rockstar mode versus superstar mode? Was that at the same time, or was that kind of after the fact that was helpful for you?
I'd say we're still on a forward motion. We're not adding as much headcount, but it's still a company that keeps morphing and finding its new shape. So I'd say it's still helpful. And actually, the Rockstar versus Superstar, it was really meaningful to me for two reasons. One, because I would have personally categorized myself for the most part of my career in the superstar section. Just like I thought that was the ideal. You're highly motivated and driven and chasing the next challenge. And I think I was treating a lot of my reports in that way of just like, I want to find the next step for you. Not maybe understanding that there were just some people who were just like happy where they were. I think there's sometimes this concept of like up or out, right? I think like many industries embrace that. And I think in a way it just became ingrained of like, that's the ideal, keep growing or get out. And it's like, oh no, there's real value to having, these people who are just like awesome at their job, safe pair of hands, just steady ship. So I think that was one reason why that really resonated. It kind of like helped me rewire like, oh, there's this other ideal that's also very, very valuable. Historically, there was definitely a bit of a notion that if you wanted to grow or be promoted, you had to become a manager. That's the way that you would grow. And as a result, we probably promoted managers who like didn't maybe have actually the motivation to become like, people managers. They were just great individual contributors. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the whole organization suffers, right? The people they're managing, the manager themselves. And I think we're now slowly embracing or trying to find this mode of, how can we career path without having to create sort of like a path inside the sort of like people management, here. And it's hard to do. And I think actually, I don't know, Kim, if you have any tips or ideas around that, because I think secretly is in a bit of an awkward size. It's about 250 employees. It's not your small mom and pop shop. People who join expect to have some form of career progression. And I think for the most part, we do have a good track record of promoting internally and finding next steps, but they're not as readily available as bigger conglomerates who have very clear laid out career paths. And I think the casualty of that sometimes has been having employees who are really good and you want to find the next step, but you just don't have it. I wonder if you have like any tips or ideas around how to manage those conversations and how to manage that dynamic.
Sure. I mean, I think you sort of just hit the nail on the head. Like at some point, you've got to be open with people. Like you want a promotion and we don't have a role. And just being honest with people about that, saying, we love you. Here's what I can do to help you get it somewhere else. Devastating because you don't want to lose these people who are awesome. But you also don't want to be like Hotel California. You can check out, but you can check in, but you can never check out. I think those open, honest conversations. And sometimes when you have that conversation with a person, they'll be so appreciative and they'll realize, oh, actually, I'm all right. I think also understanding when a person is in superstar mode, understanding why they're in superstar. Are they interested in learning and growing, but because you can get a promotion without becoming a manager, as you say, if you're in sales, you're taking on bigger customers or a bigger book of business. If you're in operations, you're learning some new skills. So you can definitely get a promotion without managing people. And you can also, just because you're a manager doesn't mean you're in superstar. Like you can be a manager at the same level for many, many years. So I think you also picked up on an important nuance there as well. I think that the good news about a company for people who are in rockstar mode that isn't so big is that they're often happier to stay. So maybe if it's not a big company, you need a greater percentage of people who are in rockstar mode. Whereas if you're in a company that's growing really fast or that's really big, you might need more people in superstar mode. And so just sort of being explicit with yourself about where folks are, I think, can be helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Great. I think you mentioned briefly unionization. I'd love to hear how that played out and if Radical Candor played a role in those conversations.
Yeah, I mean, the timing of it is very important to set the scene. That also happened over COVID. It was a really difficult moment, the way that management found out as well. We were sent the letter at the same time that a news piece went out in Rolling Stone, and it was, sort of like it felt quite emotional. We're reading reports of staff saying that they didn't feel heard. There were mentions of performative action, and I think the scene is so important because this happens over COVID, where staff are worried about their personal health, about their family's health. They're worried about their employment, mourning all the things and activities that would bring them joy. It's a joyless time.
Yeah.
And that sort of space leads towards a feedback loop of negativity as well. There's an important factor that transpires in a lot of the statements that we're making, which is the cultural sector and cultural companies can trade on this idea of cool. You're in a cool industry, and wages can be lower than other industry standards. The trade-off sometimes is like you get these cool perks, and that can be a morale boost at a certain point in your career. It can be tickets to shows, spending time with artists, attending award ceremonies. That's what some of those perks could look like. And when a company like Secretly, none of that was available over COVID. So suddenly none of those perks are available. You're just down to the basics of what is your day-to-day work life and how much are you being paid. And I think it really starts to highlight, a lot of those stressing factors. I'd say as a manager, the bits that really stung were just hearing employees saying that they didn't feel heard, and obviously also some bits around being performative and so on. During that time, we were very focused on keeping the label afloat, keeping a company going. Yeah. We were really committed to no layoffs, which we achieved. And perhaps as a result, we took the ball off of some other areas of the business, and that's fair. Again, I don't want to discount any of the claims, but I do think that those settings are just kind of really important to keep in mind. I think as management, it definitely was a moment of soul searching. It was actually really moving that unanimously and immediately we recognized the union, and we really invited to just sit at the table and come to an agreement. And I'd say it took maybe a year of negotiation to find that agreement, and it was rough and thorny at times for sure. It's difficult conversations around compensation and benefits and so on, but I truly believe that we're a stronger company for it. And it ended up in like a really good place, actually.
That's amazing. And did the union sort of help the leadership solicit feedback? I mean, from the employees, did the union help give a louder voice to employees to give feedback to leadership?
I would like to think so. I mean, I'd say at Secretly, we're already committed to, feedback. I mean, managers are encouraged and expected to have weekly one-on-ones with their reports. We have a very regular structure of reviews, twice annually. So like a real space to just make sure that you're bringing up any topics. There was one comment in that article that really stuck with me, though. An employee anonymously reported that over COVID, they were choosing to work overtime, aka inflicting pain on themselves, because they were concerned that if they brought up that they were working overtime with their manager, they would just be, subject to like really petty micromanagement. What was really interesting to me about that dynamic is I don't discount that maybe that employee manager relationship was really difficult, but it really resounded that the employee doesn't feel like they have an avenue to tell their manager, hey, you're getting in my way, or like you're really discounting my experience here. This is not a prioritization problem. I have a workload problem and I need help. So I think that really led towards us, making sure that we were all, as management aligned, that this was a, safe space, and that people had to, feel comfortable going to management. And it has to be like a two-way feedback. And in our reviews as well, we always ask for, like what's something that, your manager could do better.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, it's so important for employees to be able to prioritize their own work, right? At a certain level, that needs to come from the employee. That's why I believe in bottoms up goal setting. The employee needs to say, but the manager needs to be open to saying, okay, you're not going to do that and you are going to do that. That seems like the right prioritization, but it's got to come from the employee. And that can feel It's a hard message to deliver sometimes, I think.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like you all got that right.
It's an ongoing thing. I'd like to think that we're better than we were, and I'd like to think that we can still be better.
Yeah.
As I reflect on this conversation and just hearing from when you joined, through COVID and all of these sort of shifts in the marketplace in terms of moving into unionization and just your own kind of individual leadership journey, along with the company's desire to create more psychological safety, to have more of these feedback conversations for managers to be soliciting feedback like you're modeling. I'm wondering, for folks listening who, whether they're in your industry or not, but maybe they're in a creative industry like you are, but also with AI, that next shift that is probably on people's minds. You've dealt with COVID, the unionization, as well as really the communication challenge. Like how are you thinking about the potential challenges and opportunities for your organization, especially creative organization, based on maybe some of the lessons from the past few years?
I think it's just as an independent, like we've always had to be open to change, whether it's like the streaming revolution or, it's COVID, it can be AI and so on. It's just kind of being very open to that change and just to, pivoting as like commercial needs, come up. And I'd like to think that we can be pretty nimble on that and just, being open, like also when we don't know the answer. I think that's sort of like the real powerful bit about this is like, I might not know the best way forward, but I can promise you that we're figuring
we're working
it out.
together.
Yeah.
Do you think that creative industries are more focused on being kind or less focused? Like in Hollywood, I would describe it as not one of the few places I've ever gone where people are like, oh yeah, we're obnoxiously aggressive. Like,
and so much of your identity is attached to like, I'm a creative and I can do what, I'm just like, let the genius express the genius. What has been your experience with that?
I'd say there's definitely, like in the independent label sector, I'd say there's definitely this drive towards like, we're kind cultures. But I think there's a really important distinction that sometimes kind is misunderstood as nice. And there's a real nuance there. It's a real difference. And actually, learning, and this has been part of the Radical Candor journey, it's like learning that kind is actually often saying or doing the hard thing. Nice is actually sometimes being unkind. And I think, we've definitely had that in our organization as well. You were asking me earlier about, these restructures and so on. And I think we have had instances of staff who were either, coasting or, the company had shifted, needed something else from them. And we were trying to find them different chances, different positions, bending the org to make sure that they fit, crafting bespoke positions, and all just because we felt like the kind thing was actually having them have a job. That seemed to be like the real drive. Along with Radical Candor, another concept that really stuck with me at the time, there's this book by Will Page. He's the ex-chief economist at Spotify, and he wrote this book called Pivot. And it's about when companies are faced by disruption, when they need to shift their commercial strategy. And there's this one really succinct concept in there, which is like, you need to know when the builders need to move out and the farmers need to move in. And this idea that builders are the ideas people, farmers are the people who can scale the ideas. And at a startup, the startup company, you probably need more builders. And then eventually you would need more farmers and builders. Hit that spot of like, we're needing to achieve scale, or we need our staff, the fabric needs to be different. And it's okay to bring people along who've been there for a long time, but we need them to change. And those conversations were really tough. We needed these people to change their mindset. And I think we definitely allowed that situation to just coast for too long because, again, the driving factor was like, we want to be kind. We want to reward their loyalty. They've been here for a long time. But actually, we'd shifted to a place where we needed more process-driven, agile energy in the room. And that was not what they were bringing to the roles. Yeah. And instead, actually, I think it was worse for them as well because they ended up in these roles that didn't quite make sense, quite make sense to themselves. And I think over the course of the Radical Candor journey was actually just facing it and just being like, hey, this is actually not working out. And it's really hard, but that was actually the kind thing. So yes, I do think that kind and nice is quite something that is traded in this sector, but it doesn't actually always mean the same thing.
Very well said. I could talk. I wonder if you could share with our listeners, like, what's one very practical, tactical, radical candor practice that has helped you be a better leader and that other people could maybe try this week?
I honestly think it's the permission to say the thing. Take away the emotion, just say the thing. And like by not saying it, you're actually doing yourself and the other person a disservice. I think this idea of really embracing and like, it's okay if you're being obnoxious for a bit. Like, don't stay there, ideally. Yeah. Try and grow out of that region. But the permission of on your way to finding radical candor, to really caring personally. And obviously that's such an important part of this, right? It's like you really have to build trust before you can deliver that. Otherwise, that person isn't even actually going to care about your feedback. But I think it's the permission of just start now. Just say the thing. It might not land. You'll recover, I promise. And yeah, it's very human to worry about it, but it's actually, imagine how much greater it could be.
I love it. My great-grandmother, Granny Alice's mother, needle pointed a pillow for each of her daughters, and it said, "Say something. You can always take it back." And I think that was maybe part of what gave Granny Alice the permission, because you're right. I mean, somehow if your instinct is for ruinous empathy, you almost have to overcorrect in order to land in the
just
right
to actually
place.
Get something out of your mouth. You think it's obnoxious aggression, but really it's probably radical candor.
Or ruinous empathy. Still not clear enough.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us. Nick, do you have any final words before we do a wrap on where from pub to podcast?
It was a long time coming. This was as good as I knew it was going to be. It is just such a fun conversation to listen to. And I had a great time. I'm so glad that Chloe got to be on the show and that we met in this crazy fun way. And that here we are spreading the good word of radical candor.
Right. So we're all secretly candid. Not so secret.
That's pretty good.
I love that.
That's our title, Secretly Candid.
Secretly Candid. Well,
at Secretly.
Yeah, love it. Head on over to radicalcandor.com/podcast to see the show notes. Chloe, thanks for mentioning some of the other books that really landed with you. We'll put those out in the show notes. You can also watch this episode as a video on YouTube and Spotify. Praise in public, criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, please do rate and review us wherever you're listening or watching. If you've got feedback, please email podcast@radicalcandor.com. We read everyone. We really do appreciate it. Finally, if you want to get our newsletter straight in your inbox, go to radicalcandor.com/news. Go ahead and sign up. Thank you again, Chloe. It really was such a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for facilitating this, Nick. And, lovely to meet you, Kim, and seeing you again, Amy and Brandy. Really appreciate everyone. Thank you so much.
Love the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the Company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.